The boarding house reeked of boiled cabbage and stale tobacco, and Mara knelt in the front hall with her apron stained and her knees burning as she scrubbed at the warped planks, every stroke of the brush sending gray water sloshing against the bucket rim, while boarders shuffled past her as though she were part of the furniture, no more worthy of notice than the mud on their boots. A pair of traveling salesmen laughed, stepping wide so the slop would not touch their polished shoes, one of them muttering, "Better she soak the boards than waste space in the parlor," and the words stung sharper than the lie, burning her hands. But she bent lower. Determined to finish the corner Mrs. Kettle had barked about that morning. The landlady's voice still rang in her ears. "Rent by Saturday or out on the street, no excuses, widow or not." And Mara had answered with a nod she could barely muster, hiding the fear that coiled in her belly. She had pawned her wedding ring long ago, sold the quilt her mother stitched, even parted with the silver comb that had been her only pretty thing. Now nothing remained but the scrub brush and her weary body. As she wrung the rag, she noticed the children of another tenant pressing their faces to the stair rails, eyes wide with pity they were too young to mask. And she wanted to vanish before their sympathy shredded what little pride she clung to. A shadow lengthened across the wet boards, not Mrs. Kettle's plump shape, but taller, broader, worn boots planted steady near her bucket. Mara dared a glance upward and found Daniel Hale, the quiet cowboy who lodged upstairs, hat in his hand, eyes dark with something she could not name. He did not speak, only watched as she dipped the brush again, the silence heavier than jeers. She flushed beneath the weight of it, feeling each stroke more humiliating now that someone truly saw her labor. He shifted once, hand sliding to his coat pocket as though fingering something inside, and she caught a glint of silver, a coin flashing before he closed his fist tight. Mara turned away quickly, ashamed of how her heart leapt at the thought, as if a stranger's pity might buy her salvation. Mrs. Kettle's sharp tread rattled the hallway then, skirts swishing as she swept in to sneer. "Work faster, girl. These boards won't shine themselves, and don't think sweat will count toward rent." Mara bit her lip until she tasted blood, scrubbing harder, though her hands ached raw. Daniel's jaw clenched, a flicker of defiance flashing before he turned and strode out into the sunlight, his boots ringing against the porch boards. The salesman chuckled again, tossing a copper into her bucket so the water rippled with mockery. Mara's cheeks burned hot, but she held her brush firm, telling herself she could endure one more day, one more indignity, if only she could keep a roof above her head. As the door banged shut and the hall quieted, she pressed the rag flat and closed her eyes, whispering a prayer that someone, anyone, might see more in her than a woman on her knees. Above, a floorboard creaked where Daniel's room lay, and she wondered if he had gone upstairs or only stood there, waiting. She did not see his hand slip once more into his pocket, fingers closing around the silver coin that was his last dollar, the one choice left to him, though neither of them knew yet how dearly it would cost. By morning the ache in Mara's shoulders had settled deep into her bones, but she forced herself upright when Mrs. Kettle stormed into the hall, ledger under her arm and spectacles perched sharp upon her nose, like talons ready to tear. The landlady's cheeks were flushed from the heat of her own indignation, and her voice cracked like a whip as she slapped the ledger down on the counter. "Mara Jennings," she barked, tapping the page with her pencil. 2 weeks behind. Rent due today, or the door closes behind you. No more charity in this house." Mara's face burned as boarders looked up from their porridge in the dining room. Spoons pausing mid-air, she clutched her ragged apron, words trembling on her lips. "I'll work double, Mrs. Kettle. Scrub the stairs and the kitchen floors, wash the linens, just a little more time." The landlady sniffed, pursing her lips into a smile too thin to be kind. "Work won't pay bills, girl. You think sweat shines like silver? This house runs on dollars, not pity." Laughter rippled from the table where the two salesmen sat again, one of them whispering, "Best let her scrub till her hands fall off. Still won't fill that ledger." Mara's throat tightened, tears pricking at her eyes, but she bent her head, unwilling to give them the spectacle of her breaking. From the doorway Daniel appeared, hat in hand, shoulders tense beneath his worn coat. His gaze slid to Mara, then to Mrs. Kettle's ledger, and his jaw set. He crossed the hall slow, deliberate, boots steady against the planks. "Give her a little grace," he said quietly, voice carrying just enough for every ear to catch it. "She's working honest." The landlady snorted, folding her arms. "And who are you to tell me how to run my house? A cowboy with dust for pockets. If you want to pay her rent, then do so, else keep your tongue." The room stilled, all eyes fixed on him. Daniel's hand twitched toward his coat pocket where the silver coin lay, his last dollar. He felt its edge bite against his palm, a cruel reminder of how little stood between him and hunger. His gaze lingered on Mara, kneeling there with the rag in her raw hands, pride and shame warring on her face. For a moment he nearly drew it out, nearly laid it on the counter just to silence their laughter. But he swallowed hard and turned toward the stairs instead, muttering, "Work ought to count for something." Mrs. Kettle rolled her eyes and snapped her ledger shut with a thud. "By sundown, widow. Rent or street." She swept away, skirts swishing, leaving the hall thick with murmurs. Mara bent lower, scrubbing harder as if to prove she could turn lie into gold, but her vision blurred. The salesman chuckled again, one tossing a crust of bread at her bucket so it floated in the gray water like mockery. Daniel paused on the stairs, his knuckles white around the banister, and he almost turned back, almost placed the coin where it might save her. But he carried it upstairs instead, each step heavier, knowing the choice could not wait long. Mara whispered under her breath, "One more day," though her voice trembled, and as she wrung the rag. Her eyes flicked to the closed door above where Daniel's room lay, wondering if he too had prayed for more time. The coin in his pocket seemed to weigh more than the whole house, and both knew that by sundown the burden would demand its answer. By afternoon the boarding house smelled of stew and smoke, the dining hall crowded with boarders bent over bowls, their voices rising in chatter that fell silent when Mrs. Kettle marched Mara in with a broom still dripping from the morning's work. The landlady carried the rent ledger like a judge's decree, and her lips curled into a thin smile as she banged it down on the head table. 2 weeks past due," she announced loud enough for every spoon to pause. "And a widow's tears don't buy coal. Unless this floor scrubber finds coin by nightfall, she sleeps in the street." Murmurs rippled through the room, some pitying, most cruel. A farmer at the corner table chuckled. "Best let her scrub the porch, too. At least the street will shine when she's tossed out." Laughter followed, sharp and biting. Mara stood with her head bowed, her apron soaked, hands raw from lye, the rag dangling from her fingers like a flag of surrender. She wanted to melt into the floorboards, but Mrs. Kettle's grip on her elbow held her upright for every sneer to see. "Beg them," the landlady hissed under her breath. "Maybe someone will toss a coin if you grovel." Mara's chest burned with humiliation, but her lips pressed tight. She had begged once, in the first winter after her husband's death, and the memory still tasted of ashes. Across the hall, Daniel Hale sat at the edge of a long table, hat in his lap, shoulders coiled like rope under strain. His eyes locked on Mara, seeing more than shame, seeing the battle raging behind her silence. He slid his hand into his coat pocket, feeling again the ridged edge of the silver coin that had become both salvation and curse. His jaw worked, his pulse pounding, but he kept it clenched in his fist, knowing once given it could never be returned. A boarder raised his cup. "What's the price of pity tonight, Mrs. Kettle? $1 buys her bed? $half to let her scrub the stairs?" More laughter, mean and ugly. Mara's face flushed crimson, and for the first time her eyes flicked to Daniel, desperation flickering before she forced it down. She would not ask him, not him or anyone, to waste their last scrap of kindness on her ruin. Mrs. Kettle thumped the ledger shut, the sound like a nail in a coffin. "Sundown," she repeated, voice slicing through the smirks. "Sundown or she's out. Let the town see how far scrubbing gets a woman with no man to claim her." She released Mara's arm, shoving her forward, so she stumbled into the center of the hall. The rag fell from her hand into a puddle, water splashing against her skirts. For a moment silence reigned, the crowd watching her crouch to retrieve it, her pride bent lower than her body. Daniel's hand tightened around the coin until the edge cut into his palm, drawing a bead of blood. He rose halfway from his seat, the urge to stride forward burning in his chest, but he forced himself back down, breath ragged. Not yet, he told himself. Not while eyes were so hungry for spectacle. Mara straightened with the rag in her grip, eyes hollow, and turned to leave the hall. Behind her, whispers followed like hounds. Daniel stood at last, hat crushed in his fist, his steps carrying him toward the door she had just passed through, the coin heavy as judgment in his pocket. Tonight, he knew, the choice would come, and when it did, he would not watch her crawl again. Daniel paced his narrow room beneath the eaves, the floor creaking with each turn as he rubbed the silver coin between his fingers, its ridged edge now stained faintly with the cut it had left in his palm. Outside the window, the evening sun slanted across the roofs, painting the street in copper light, but he saw only the memory of Mara kneeling in the dining hall, her face burning as laughter circled her like wolves. He had fought cattle rustlers, faced storms that tore fences flat, buried his own brother in a field of dust, and none of it had left him feeling so powerless as watching one woman made to scrub her dignity away for boarders who couldn't spare an ounce of decency. He set the coin on the sill, staring at it as though it might answer. It was his last $1, saved through months of work too hard and meals too lean, meant for winter seed or a pair of boots when the soles of his current ones finally gave way. He could not earn another soon. The drives had ended, wages low, jobs scarce. Yet what worth was a coin hoarded if it bought only his own pride while another starved? Downstairs, Mara scrubbed still, the sound of her brush echoing faint through the boards. Daniel gritted his teeth. A knock rattled his door. He opened it to find Elbert, one of the boarders, smirking with a cigar between his fingers. "Evenin', Hale. They say the widow's out by nightfall. Might get interesting. Shame to waste a roof on her when stronger backs need it." He chuckled and strolled away, leaving smoke in his wake. Daniel's jaw hardened. He slipped the coin back into his pocket, fists curling. He would not let Mara be driven into the street while men like Elbert drank and sneered. Below, Mara wrung her rag into the bucket, her arms trembling from hours bent low. Mrs. Kettle swept past, ledger tucked tight beneath her arm, and paused long enough to sneer. "Don't think a cowboy's pity will save you. Men leave quicker than debts." Mara bit back tears, her voice soft. "I'll find a way." But even she could not name it. Her fingers ached, skin split at the knuckles, and still the floor shone no brighter. She reached into her apron pocket, finding it empty. Nothing left to trade, nothing to pawn. She remembered her husband's Bible, sold for pennies the winter after he died, and shame swelled until she nearly gagged. She pressed her forehead to her knees, whispering, "Lord, just one more day. From the stairwell, Daniel's boots thudded, steady, each step like a vow. He paused in the hall, his gaze falling on her bent figure, the rag clutched in shaking hands. The boarders at their tables quieted, sensing something about to break. Daniel touched the coin in his pocket, the metal burning against his thigh. His voice was low but carried. "Mrs. Kettle?" She turned, her brows arched. "What now?" He pulled the coin free, holding it up so it glinted in the lamplight. Every eye followed its shimmer. "Her rent," he said, steady. Gasps rippled, the room tensing, but Daniel did not move closer. Not yet. He closed his fist again, voice rough. "If I must, I'll lay it down before sundown." He turned and strode back up the stairs, leaving silence in his wake. Mara stared after him, her breath caught, the rag limp in her grip. For the first time since her husband's death, she felt the ground shift, not in ruin but in the faint stirrings of hope, and fear of what sacrifice might be asked to buy it. The sun slanted low through the boarding house windows, its golden beams falling across wet planks and catching on the silver edge of the coin, as Daniel finally stepped into the hall where Mara scrubbed on her knees, her body bent with exhaustion and humiliation, while the boarders lounged in chairs, pretending not to stare, but listening all the same. Mrs. Kettle hovered by the counter, ledger open, her pencil poised like a blade ready to sever the last thread of mercy. "Time's near spent," she barked. "Rent unpaid means the street for you, girl." Mara flinched, but kept her head bowed, rag dragging across the grain. Pride burning so fierce she could not raise her eyes. The salesman chuckled, one whispering, "Watch, she'll crawl lower yet." Daniel's boots struck steady against the boards as he crossed the hall, every step ringing like a hammer. His hand slid into his pocket, fingers closing around the coin, and in that moment the weight of it felt like more than silver. It felt like choice, like judgment, like the line between shame and dignity. He halted beside Mara, the whole room hushed, eyes fixed on the stranger whose silence had stretched too long. Mara dared a glance upward, her gaze colliding with his. And in it she saw the storm he had wrestled alone. Without a word, Daniel opened his hand, bent low, and let the coin fall to the wet boards beside her scrub brush. The metallic clink echoed louder than any shout, reverberating through the hall until even Mrs. Kettle's tongue stilled. Mara froze, staring at the coin gleaming in the soap water, the same coin he had hidden so long, and her breath caught sharp in her throat. Daniel's voice followed, rough but certain. "That pays her rent." Gasps broke from the boarders, murmurs rising like thunder. The salesman's smirks faltered, one muttering, "His last $1." Mrs. Kettle's eyes narrowed. Suspicion and greed warring in her expression as she snapped, "A single coin for 2 weeks' room? You mock me!" Daniel's gaze hardened, his voice booming now. "It is all I have, and it is more than you've shown her. A man's last dollar weighs heavier than a miser's purse." Mara's hand trembled as she touched the coin, her fingers brushing the cold silver, and tears welled unbidden. She whispered hoarsely, "You shouldn't," but he shook his head. "I won't watch you crawl while others laugh." The hall erupted, some jeering, some gasping, all feeding on the drama. Mrs. Kettle slammed her ledger shut, muttering about rules and proper payment. But her cheeks reddened beneath the gaze of every witness. Daniel's jaw stayed set, his boots firm, his eyes locked on Mara as if daring the world to strip her dignity again. Mara clutched the coin in her palm, feeling its weight sear into her skin, not as charity, but as covenant. Around them the boarders whispered, their laughter quenched, their scorn unsettled, for they had seen something they could not easily mock. A man laying down his last possession for a woman on her knees. Mrs. Kettle sputtered, "We'll see the sheriff about this." But her voice lacked its former bite. Daniel turned, his hand brushing the brim of his hat, and said low, "See who you will? I've paid in full." He strode toward the stairs, the hall parting before him, leaving Mara kneeling in the soap water, her rag limp, her breath shaking, the coin blazing in her palm like a promise too costly to ignore. The following morning, the boarding house air was thick with tension, every whisper circling like vultures over the previous night's scene. Mara lingered by the wash basin, clutching the coin in her apron pocket as though it might vanish if she let it go. She had not slept, every creak of the old house reminding her that Mrs. Kettle's ledger was not erased by a single act of mercy. Daniel came down the stairs, slow, hat in hand, eyes shadowed from his own restless night. He paused at the bottom, meeting her gaze, and though no words passed between them, the silence carried more weight than speech. A knock thundered on the door before either could move. Mrs. Kettle swept forward, skirts snapping, and pulled it wide to reveal Sheriff Hollis, his badge gleaming, his jaw set hard. The sheriff removed his hat, his eyes cutting to Mara first, then Daniel. "I hear a man threw down his last dollar and called it rent," he said evenly. "The town's asking if law will let sentiment rewrite the books." Mrs. Kettle sniffed triumphantly, waving her ledger like a banner. "That's right, Sheriff. I keep house by order, not pity. If you allow this, every stray will be hiding behind tears and a man's foolish coin." Murmurs rose among the boarders who had gathered in the hall, eager for another show. Mara's face burned, shame threatening to crush her, though she had done nothing but scrub and endure. Daniel stepped forward, shoulders square, voice rough but steady. "It was my dollar, last I had, worth more than all their jeers. I'll not let it be mocked." The sheriff studied him, eyes narrowing. "Last dollar or not, Hale, rules don't bend easy. A woman's rent is coin, not sentiment. If you mean to keep her under this roof, you'd better make it proper, or tongues will tear you both apart." Mara's chest tightened, her fingers tightening around the coin through the cloth of her apron. She wanted to speak, to protest that she had not asked him, but the words stuck, torn between pride and gratitude. Mrs. Kettle smirked, arms folded. "You hear that? Proper payment or she's in the street. By sundown again, Sheriff?" The sheriff's gaze flicked back to Mara, softer now, though still stern. "By sundown," he said, nodding once. Then to Daniel, his voice low with warning. "Don't think one brave act shields you. The town is watching, and they'll not forgive weakness." With that he set his hat back on and strode out, boots heavy against the porch. The door shut, leaving silence thick as smoke. Mara felt every eye burning into her, boarders whispering already. Daniel turned to her, his voice quiet. "I meant it, Mara. That coin's yours now. Let them mock." She shook her head, tears brimming, her voice breaking. "It was too dear a price. You've left yourself with nothing." He met her gaze, unwavering. "Better me with nothing than you with nothing and shame besides." For a moment neither moved, the murmurs fading as the boarders drifted back to their meals. But Mrs. Ishtora Kettle lingered, lips curling. "We'll see what you pay come sundown," she hissed, retreating to her office with the ledger clutched like a weapon. Mara's knees trembled, but she stood straighter than she had the night before, the coin heavy in her pocket. She knew now the battle was not only for a bed under a roof, but for her dignity before the whole town. And with every tick of the clock toward sundown, the weight of that coin grew heavier, demanding a reckoning no prayer could postpone. By afternoon, the boarding house had turned into a theater, every boarder waiting for the next act in a play Mara wished she could flee. The dining room bustled with forced laughter and clinking spoons, but beneath it all, a hum of anticipation vibrated, eyes cutting to her as she passed with her bucket and brush, whispers trailing behind her like smoke. Daniel kept to his chair by the window, hat in his lap, his gaze steady on the street beyond, though every muscle in his jaw spoke of storm. Mrs. Kettle swept in at last, ledger under her arm, spectacles perched on her nose, her smile sharp with victory already claimed. She laid the book flat on the front desk, tapping the page where Mara's name sat, inked and waiting. "By sundown," she declared to the gathered boarders, "we settle this nonsense. $1 may buy sympathy, but rent requires more." The room chuckled with agreement, and Mara felt heat climb her throat. She bent lower with her brush, knuckles raw, though each stroke of the bristles felt like dragging her dignity further across splintered wood. The salesmen snickered at their table, one calling, "Maybe she'll sing for supper next, eh?" The laughter that followed rang cruel, but then Daniel rose, his chair scraping hard across the planks, silencing the room. He walked to the counter, coin clutched in his fist, and laid it down on the open ledger with a sound that cracked the air. Gasps fluttered, the boarders craning for a better view. Daniel's voice was low but carried. "Her rent. Paid." Mrs. Kettle's nostrils flared. She prodded the coin with her pencil as though it might bite her. "1 coin for 2 weeks' board? You insult me, Hale." Daniel leaned forward, his eyes burning. "It is all I have. My last. Worth more than all your smug laughter and twice the dignity." Murmurs rippled, some boarders shifting uncomfortably. Mara froze, her brush slipping from her hand into the bucket with a splash. She rose slowly, apron dripping, eyes wide. She wanted to tell him no, to beg him not to throw his future away for her shame. But the words died when she saw the fire in his face. Mrs. Kettle pursed her lips, then raised her voice for all to hear. "Sheriff will decide. I'll not mark this book till law says so. If he rules it false, both of you can take your pride into the street." The boarders gasped, thrilled by the promise of greater spectacle, and whispers surged like a tide. Daniel stood tall, voice steady. "Then let the sheriff come. I'll stand by what I've given." His words hung heavy, undeniable. Mara's heart thundered, torn between despair and hope. She stepped to his side, fingers brushing his sleeve as though drawn by something stronger than fear. Whispers rippled again, this time not all cruel, some tinged with surprise at her boldness. Mrs. Kettle snapped her ledger shut, retreating with a huff. But the damage was done. Every soul in the room had seen a man stake his last coin on a widow's dignity. The salesmen no longer laughed, their smirks brittle in the silence. Mara swallowed hard, whispering only for him. "You should not have." Daniel glanced down at her, his jaw softening though his eyes stayed fierce. "I could not do otherwise." Outside, the sheriff's shadow crossed the window pane as he strode toward the door, and the room held its breath, knowing the final judgment was about to be written not in ink but in choice. The door groaned open, and Sheriff Hollis stepped into the boarding house, his boots heavy with authority, his eyes sweeping the crowded hall where boarders pressed close for spectacle. He removed his hat, gaze settling first on Mrs. Kettle clutching her ledger like scripture, then on Daniel standing firm by the counter, Mara at his side with wet apron and trembling hands. The sheriff's voice cut through the murmurs like a saw. "I hear tell a man laid down his last coin to cover a widow's rent, and a house full of tongues wag it ain't proper." Mrs. Kettle puffed herself taller, snapping the ledger open on the counter and stabbing her pencil at Mara's name. "See for yourself, Sheriff. Weeks behind. 1 coin against debt owed. It's mockery of order." Whispers swirled, a few boarders nodding agreement, others shifting uneasily. The sheriff's eyes moved to Daniel. "That true? You paid with your last?" Daniel held his gaze steady, the silver coin glinting on the ledger between them. "True enough. My last dollar, and it bought her dignity before the whole town's laughter. Seems a fair trade to me." Murmurs rippled, some surprised, some scoffing. Hollis's brow furrowed. The lines of a man weary of judgment but bound to deliver it. "Dignity don't fill ledgers, Hale. You know that. Law keeps order, and order keeps roofs overhead." Mara's breath caught, shame threatening to swallow her, but then she stepped forward, her voice raw. "Sheriff, I've scrubbed these floors till my hands bleed. Every penny I've ever had went to pay. If law can't see sweat as worth, then what is left for women like me?" Gasps fluttered, for seldom did she raise her voice, and the sheriff blinked, taken aback by her boldness. He studied her, then Daniel, then the eager crowd, the weight of their hunger for scandal pressing heavy. Slowly he reached for the coin, turning it in his palm, the metal glinting against calloused fingers. He held it up, his voice carrying. $1, the last this man has, given not for himself but for another's shelter. I'll weigh that heavier than a purse full of coppers tossed for mockery." The boarders erupted, some gasping in outrage, others clapping soft approval. Mrs. Kettle sputtered, cheeks flaming. "Sheriff, you can't!" But he raised his hand, silencing her. "I can. The rent's marked paid." With deliberate motion, he set the coin back on the ledger and drew his pencil through Mara's debt. The scratch of graphite louder than the whispers. The room hushed, stunned. Daniel exhaled slow, his shoulders easing though his jaw stayed firm. Mara's eyes flooded, her throat tight with relief and disbelief. Mrs. Kettle slammed the ledger shut, glaring daggers. "Fine, but when next week comes, she'll find no grace here." She swept from the hall, skirts snapping like banners of defeat. The sheriff replaced his hat, meeting Daniel's eyes. "You've bought her 1 week. Make it count. Town won't forget quick." He turned and strode out, leaving silence in his wake. Daniel stood tall beside Mara. The coin now hers to keep, though it no longer belonged to his pocket. The boarders broke into murmurs again, some glancing with new respect, others muttering of foolishness. Mara pressed a trembling hand over her apron pocket, as though the coin were already safe within, whispering hoarsely, "You gave away all you had." Daniel looked down at her, his voice low. "All I had was nothing, until I gave it." And as the crowd whispered and the sheriff's boots faded down the street, Mara knew the true weight of a coin was not in silver, but in sacrifice that refused to bend before scorn. By week's end, the boarding house had become a furnace of whispers, every tenant waiting to see whether Mrs. Kettle would carry through her threat. Mara scrubbed harder than ever, her knuckles cracked and raw, though each stroke felt less like labor and more like defiance. The silver coin never left her apron pocket, its weight a reminder of Daniel's sacrifice, but also a fear that 1 week's reprieve could vanish like smoke. On Saturday evening, the boarders crowded the dining hall again, bowls pushed aside, eyes gleaming with hunger for spectacle. Mrs. Kettle strode to the counter, ledger under her arm, lips tight with triumph. She opened the book with a snap, tapping Mara's name for all to hear. "Rent due again, and this time no sheriff's tricks will save you." Murmurs rippled, a salesman chuckling, "Let's see if her cowboy's pockets still jingle." Mara froze, hands gripping her rag, shame threatening to break her resolve. But then Daniel rose from his chair at the edge of the room, hat in hand, boots steady as he crossed the hall. He pulled the coin from Mara's apron pocket, where she had hidden it in trust, his fingers brushing hers with a silent vow, and stepped to the ledger. The room hushed, the scrape of his boots echoing like drums. Without a word, he slammed the coin down on the page so hard the ledger shook, the silver ringing against the wood. Gasps erupted, the boarders leaning forward, some startled, others smirking. Daniel's voice thundered, rough with fury. "Paid, by my last dollar. You'll not shame her again." The words cracked through the hall like a shot, silencing laughter. Mrs. Kettle's face flushed scarlet, her pencil trembling in her hand. "You mock my house, Hale. 1 coin against weeks owed? This is madness." Daniel's jaw clenched, his eyes burning. Madness is mocking a woman who works till her blood stains the floor. Madness is a crowd jeering while she scrubs like a servant to keep her dignity. This coin is worth more than all your accounts. Mara's breath hitched, tears brimming as she clutched Sparrow's broken doll in her apron, the token of her past life mixing with the weight of the coin. For the first time she felt the gaze of the room shift. Not all sneers, some softened, some unsettled. A matron in gray murmured, "He speaks true," and the whisper spread. Mrs. Kettle sputtered, caught between greed and pride, but Sheriff Hollis's figure filled the doorway, his voice cutting. "Enough. The town's heard enough mockery. The debt stands paid." He strode to the counter, eyes hard, and under the weight of his presence, Mrs. Kettle dared not protest. With a grimace, she scratched a line through Mara's name, the pencil dragging like chains across the page. The boarders gasped, the finality of it clear. Daniel stepped back, chest heaving, his fist unclenched at last. He turned to Mara, his voice softer now, though the fire still burned. "No one can call you debtor again." Mara pressed a trembling hand to her pocket, though the coin no longer rested there. Instead, its weight had passed into her heart, heavy with sacrifice, but steady with hope. The room broke into whispers, some calling Daniel a fool, others nodding in quiet respect. Mara stood straighter, pride rekindled, while Mrs. Kettle slammed the ledger shut and stormed from the hall, her reign of humiliation broken. And as the sheriff lingered by the door, Daniel's eyes never left Mara's, both knowing the cost had been dear, but dignity had been bought in silver and in fire. The boarding house never sounded the same after that night. Where once laughter had curled cruel around Mara's bent back, now silence followed her, heavy and uneasy, as if the boarders feared their jeers might echo too loudly against the memory of the sheriff's decree. Mrs. Kettle carried her ledger like a wounded bird, snapping it shut whenever Mara passed, her pride bruised deeper than her purse. Daniel moved about the halls as quietly as ever, yet eyes trailed him, whispers chasing in his wake, some calling him fool, others murmuring of courage. But for Mara, everything had shifted. The coin no longer jingled in her apron pocket. Instead, she kept it wrapped in a strip of linen and tucked within the Bible. Daniel pressed into her hands, its pages thin with use, its cover worn soft. "Keep it safe," he had said the morning after, voice low, eyes steady. "It's worth more now than when it left my pocket." She had nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat, and hidden it beneath her pillow as though it were treasure. Each night she pulled it free, running her fingers over the ridges, remembering the sound it made when it struck the ledger, when it rang louder than mockery and silenced laughter into awe. It had become more than coin. It was covenant. The moment dignity was bought not with wealth, but with sacrifice. Days stretched on, her work no lighter but her back straighter, her eyes meeting those who dared to stare. The boarders who once tossed crumbs into her bucket now turned away, unable to match her gaze. And Daniel, though his boots were worn and his purse empty, carried himself taller, as if in giving he had gained more than he lost. One evening Mara sat by the fire, with the Bible open on her lap, the coin glinting between its pages. Daniel paused in the doorway, watching her fingers trace the metal. "You could have kept it," she whispered, still awed. "Saved it for seed, for boots, for yourself." He shook his head, his voice quiet but firm. "I had no need greater than yours. $1 only buys what's spent on. I chose to spend it on you." Tears blurred her vision, but they did not fall in shame this time. She closed the Bible, pressing it to her chest, the coin sealed within. The room seemed warmer for it, the fire brighter. Daniel stepped inside, his shadow stretching across the floorboards she had scrubbed so often, and for the first time, Mara did not see herself as the widow on her knees, but as a woman standing on ground her dignity had claimed. She looked at him, voice trembling yet sure. "Then let it be the first coin of our new account, not debt, but hope." His eyes softened, and he nodded, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. The fire crackled between them, the sound as steady as a vow. Outside the town whispered still, but within the small room dignity had been restored, written not in Mrs. Kettle's ledger, but in sacrifice, sealed by silver. Mara laid the Bible on the table, her hand resting on it, the coin secure inside. No longer a symbol of debt, but of worth beyond measure. And as the prairie wind rattled the shutters, she knew that when history remembered her, it would not be as the woman who scrubbed floors, but as the one whose dignity was bought with a cowboy's last dollar and never again surrendered. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more true-hearted stories on Echoes of the West. If you only had $1 left, would you keep it for yourself or spend it to save another's dignity?